God has specifically chosen you to be here at this time and in this place. You have incredible potential, purpose, and calling to push back the darkness and be a light for Christ. Stand for nothing and you'll fall for anything. It's time to stand your ground. This is Unapologetic. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Unapologetic conversation. For this episode, I get the privilege of sitting down with preacher, teacher, and author Luke Lezon. Luke is the lead pastor of LifeBridge Church in Orlando, Florida, the author of Your Mess Matters, and the founder of Quay, a young adult movement that has reached thousands of 18 to 35-year-olds with the gospel. I'm so excited to talk with Luke today about his story, pastoring a church at such a young age, and why he's so passionate about bringing Jesus to the younger generation. Please help me welcome Luke to the show. Hi, Luke.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on, Julie. I'm really excited to be here with you. It really is an honor.
Yeah, I'm super excited to have you. We're going to start out asking you the question that I ask everyone, which is, what do you wish Christians would stop apologizing for?
That's such a good question. You know, I think I'll unpack it a little bit, but I think the thing I wish Christians would stop apologizing for is God. I wish that people would stop apologizing for what his word has to say. I wish they would stop apologizing and acting like there's got to be some caveat that goes along with what it is that God lays out for us in the scriptures, that there are things that we believe that are a part of our faith. And I think very often, probably Christians more than any other religion find themselves in a place of just kind of trying to either explain away their disposition that they believe from, or just try to explain away, hey, you know, I know that this is what God's word has to say, but I get it. I wish it was different too. And I think for me, I just wish that we would stop trying to find a way to apologize for what God said as if there was something in our life that we think we have a better understanding of. So I really wish that we would just stand on the truths that he's laid out for us and be like, hey, we believe that he has laid out human flourishing as best as it can possibly be laid out for. And so we're done apologizing for who God is and what God says.
That is such an interesting answer. No one has said that, by the way. I remember reading this one time. It was from a theologian. He was saying the fact that we argue with the Bible doesn't show our graciousness or our mercy. It shows our sinfulness. And I was like, okay, like that makes so much sense. Like the fact that I have a problem with scripture doesn't mean I'm more holy or I'm more understanding or merciful. It shows how sinful we really are, even as Christians, to not agree with the Bible. That's interesting. So I have to say what we talked about before we started airing. If you're listening today, I'm so glad you're here. But I was talking to Luke, and you know, one thing special about this interview today is that I'm actually talking to someone who is also in real life church ministry, not just someone who's talking about ministry or commenting about ministry or criticizing ministry. And the reason I want to point that out is because for whatever reason, it's a big trend right now. People kind of making an entire platform off of exposing the church or talking about bad things that have happened in the church. Instead of really trying to lift up and encourage and highlight people that are doing the ministry of the church, but of course, and it's not only people that are paid to do that, but I want to point out that there's a very big difference between people who are actually in church ministry work versus people that are just talking about it. Luke, I'm just going to let you go from there.
I think very often, I find myself comforted by Teddy Roosevelt's The Man in the Arena, where he just talks about, hey, it's completely different to be in there when you've got blood, sweat, and tears in the game. And the easy thing to do is be the critics from the stands talking about how the guy in the arena is stumbling and falling. And very often it's just like, hey, I'd rather be the one in the arena stumbling and falling and fighting for something than the person criticizing from the stands. Wow. And so we find ourselves in a place right now where we're trying to get as many people involved in the game as we possibly can because we believe that time is short and we've got a lot of urgency around what we're doing. So, you know, my my ministry has kind of been all over the place. I mean, I came down here to begin in Orlando a young adult ministry, but kind of going hand in hand with that idea of the man in the arena is after just about 9 months of doing that, I found myself in a position where our church went through a massive church split. And as a result, there was nobody else that could take over the church. Nobody really wanted to touch it. It wasn't an attractive place to be, despite having, some beautiful property and opportunity to especially live in Orlando. There's worse places to live. So I found myself in a place where I was planning on doing young adult ministry, and they asked if for a year, our board asked if I would consider preaching every Thursday night to young adults and then preaching every Sunday morning also to the congregation. And for a little bit, I wasn't sure that we were going to make it. But slowly but surely, God has just been so kind, blessed our church in incredible ways. And we've like grown 4 times what we were when I took it over by the grace of God, just because I think they needed someone willing to step in there and not be critical of what it has been, but actually see the potential of where it could be. And so we've been excited to actually take the reins on that and be in a beautiful place that, took a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to get here. So I couldn't appreciate your comments more. And I think it's so true.
It's been an interesting experience growing up with a mega church head pastor, and I'm probably the biggest fan of the church and my dad and ministry families in general. I'm not sure that it's always understood exactly the spiritual warfare or what really goes on in families and just kind of what it looks like. I think one of the best things, like I've told my dad, like one of the best things, the best gifts that I was ever given was a dad that really was the same, like at church and at home. It was the best gift. And it's what made it really easy for me to answer the call. When God called me to ministry, I was like, what else would I do? Like, I love this. I was talking with the pastor's daughter about it because I think it also is a gift. It's weird, and I want to hear what you think about this, like in the sense that we already understanding Christians and this being basically your whole world, like I know that Christians aren't always nice. I know that Christians are going to disappoint. I know that they're going to sin big time, that I'll sin, that like I already know all that. And so for me, it's a gift because I don't personally struggle when I hear about people falling. And this other person had said the same thing. But I want you to I want to hear what you think about that, because right now, like so many famous Christians or big ministries that are being highlighted because of huge, massive errors and failures. And a lot of people, like, that is a huge stumbling block for them. Do you have, like, what would you say to that? How can they have strong faith even whenever ministry leaders disappoint?
I think there's a very thin distinction that exists between disappointment and surprise. And so I'm disappointed because I definitely would hope that everybody would be walking and living in a way that's above reproach. But all at the same time, I'm not at all surprised. I think it's just so interesting that one of the things that, regardless of what church you grow up in, it really doesn't matter your background or denomination, you find yourself hearing all of these stories about these people in the scriptures that are filled with these hurts and hang-ups, and they're misfits and they're misaligned with all of the things that God's called them to do, and yet they're called anyway. And so, I think even from the standpoint of looking at people that have had some kind of moral failure or anything like that, you go, well, I mean, how far back do we want to take this? Do we want to stop reading the Psalms? Like, what exactly do we want to do with that? Because, some of our greatest spiritual heroes that are even listed in Hebrews 11 Hall of Faith found themselves in a place of some major catastrophe and failure. And so I definitely think there's a little bit of failure porn going around even within the church today, where it's just like an exciting thing for people to speculate on, look at, and find themselves just overly indulging themselves in it to the point where it actually creates a callousness within your heart. And so my thing is, I think you pray for those individuals that find themselves in that position. Be unsurprised at the fact that sin is something that exists in all people, and be also hopeful and prayerful about the people that need to be continued to be lifted up. Because there's a lot of great voices out there that I think are yet to be discovered, that are going to help really champion the church in America moving forward. And so there's more to be excited about than there is to be disappointed in. But I think it doesn't mean that we stop feeling the hurt all the same. So I'm excited about the future of the church. Probably unlike any other time.
I have to ask you, did you just say failure porn? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you kind of elaborate a little bit on that? That was a really interesting way to say that.
I think just the same effects that you see that pornography can have on a society, where people it's pervasive. It's in front of you, even when you don't necessarily want it to be sometimes. That if you want to indulge yourself in it, you can. And then whenever you do, it creates a callousness in your intimacy and life with another individual down the road, whether you find yourself indulging in that sin because as you're already married or you aspire to be someday, it will end up rearing its ugly head at you at some point. So failure porn is very similar. It's just we really love watching anything that we feel like is a train wreck. And we don't think it's doing anything to us. We don't think it's harmful. We explain it away. We think that it'll be okay in the long run. But at the end of the day, it's creating a callousness in our heart towards leadership in general, I think authorities in general. And it makes us feel like everything that is going on in our life and our inability to follow any kind of leader or authority is justified in some way. And of course, there are some leaders that have some things that they need to go on sabbatical for or get better. But for the most part, there is an addiction to failure porn. I think maybe in particular in the church. I can just create a podcast over people that have failed, and it's going to get a ton of downloads.
That's exactly what I was about to say.
I definitely think that there's a way to where it's like, hey, we can learn from people's failures. Yeah. I'll say one thing I love, and I think I've heard this in you, is just like, I'm not surprised if I hear that somebody fails. I definitely feel like, man, I'm like, Lord, search me and know me in the middle of those things. It's like, because I realize I could easily be the next person to do something like that. Exactly. There's nothing that makes me that much better than anybody else. And so it's like, do I want to like learn what I could do better from these things? Absolutely. But do I want to like create a platform around the failures of other people? Like, no, not at all. And I don't think God loves that. I think he would love for us to be able to learn lessons that'll be helpful to keep us from doing those things in the future without monetizing how it is that I can like stand upon your bones.
All right. I think we're on the same page there. So we're switching gears. You had an illness a few years ago that almost took your life. Obviously did not, but is the basis for your book. Can you tell us just about that?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, just nobody knew what it was. I mean, I think I had been in Israel, and while I was in Israel, and I found myself doing a couple other international trips that year, I just found myself like losing a bunch of weight, and I didn't know what was going on. At the time, actually, I thought, you know what? I'm just like getting really fit. I was like working out at the time. And I was like, look at me go. And then there became a point where I was like, this doesn't look good. So I don't know what's going on. And I realized that I was thinner than I'd ever been in my life. I mean, then at my most fit point in high school and stuff like that, which just didn't make sense to me, because I wasn't nearly as active and I wasn't really going for that. And so over time, they found out like that I had a really highly elevated white blood cell count, and they were concerned that it could be cancer associated with the weight loss and things of that nature. And so there was some real panic there. And over time, it became a thing where, as I started to get more and more involved, there were other doctors that were determining that, hey, they could actually rule out some of those worst case scenario things about 4 months in, but they still couldn't pinpoint what was going on. And then over time, they found out that I just had like parasites just like absolutely destroying me from the inside. And so they didn't really know where it had come from or what had happened. But I think like the biggest thing in that was just this idea, like the battle of uncertainty when some of those things are going on and just being emaciated is just difficult. And so it was one of those things where I was just like being bedridden essentially, and being in a place as a striver kind of naturally to where you have to just sit and simmer in, is God good? And is he with me? And this was a difficult place to be. Yeah. I think I was dealing with the one thing in my life at that point where I was just like, man, everything that I stand on and believe. And it's kind of like what you said with your father. It's just like, man, you get home, you're like, hey, we really believe all this stuff. And there's some beauty in that. But you come to find out as you have conversations with people like, man, there's usually one or two things that people kind of come back to that made them get to a point where they're like, do I believe this? Like, is this something that I actually am standing on? And so I just found myself in the middle of my own messiness in my life at that point, talking with other people that were kind of having their own things. And I realized there are these one or two things in everybody's life that really is the crux of like, hey, am I somebody who wants to continue to walk this walk? And so I decided to write the book just because early in pastoral ministry, that was 99% of my conversations with people. And I'm sure they are with you too, where it's just like, well, I went through this, or I'm dealing with this, or I'm concerned about this. And it's just something past, present, or future is always fighting for your affections in Jesus. And I just realized, you know what? I think there's a way that we can help tackle these things. And the reality is like God doesn't usually work around messes. He works in them. And so what does that look like if he's going to work in them? Because it's one thing to know it. It's another thing to live it. And so I just wanted to do something that would practically help people live in the middle of that with like a good theological base and understanding. And so it's been amazing to see the way that people have had something more firm that they can stand on.
Yes, you probably don't know this, but I have triplets, and we almost lost them at 23 weeks. And I was on bed rest for 50 days in the hospital. And they were saying, you're going to lose them, not going to make it. And so it was 50 days of laying there like, okay, I really believe this. I've been called up to the plate. Glad I had so much scripture on reserves. But I mean, it was like, this is it. I mean, this is rubber meets the road. And it's so weird. But I feel like even though it was like the scariest, without a doubt, the biggest, scariest thing we ever went through, now, whenever I read the New Testament and think about it's a gift, it was a gift to suffer. It really was a gift to be tried, because that closeness and that like refined by fire, it was just very interesting to then have such like incredible moments and then go on to live your daily life. But I did get to hear so many other people's stories and how it changed their lives too. It's a different way to bond when people share those stories, for sure.
That's one of the hardest things about ministry, right? I mean, I feel like people are impressed with your strengths, but they're connected by your weaknesses. And that's something that we just repeatedly find over and over across our ministry. And so like, we just have this deep commitment to like, if you're going to bear one another's burdens, you got to know what the burdens are. And so we just want to always be open and transparent about what they are. I mean, because it's like, I think it's 2 Corinthians 1:8-9. Paul says, hey, brothers and sisters, we don't want you to be unaware of the afflictions that we were dealing with in Asia. And I'm like, that's the opposite of the church today, is we want everybody to be unaware of the afflictions that we're dealing with. And there's no way that you can bear an affliction that you know nothing about.
Wow, that's really interesting. I've more focused on in James where it's confess your sins to one another and be healed. Like if we don't have a time in our church where you can confess your sins, like when is that supposed to happen? Like when does that verse happen? What's the format? Like, is it Sunday school? Is it community groups? Like when are we creating a space to be able to do that in a safe way that also heals people? Let's talk about young adult ministry, because a lot of people are not in young adult ministry these days. We went from youth ministry to young adult, and that was because we poured our lives into teenagers, and then they were turning 18, and that was not the time for them not to have someone focusing on them. My husband says it's the most important time in your life, and a lot of people are taking time off from church, from their faith. So can you talk about, like, I love young adult ministry. Like, we just started it here. I do it specifically for girls, but can you just tell us about why it's exciting and important?
I think it's important for the very reasons that you said. I think that it is the easiest target demographic to miss, and it has been for decades. I think most churches, I don't have an actual stat on this, but I would put a strong bet that 80% of churches don't have a young adult ministry.
Oh, yeah.
Then we start to wonder, hey, why is my church either really, really old, Or why is it that I'm not having people at all? And very often it's because we just left people floating after youth ministry. And then we send them off traditionally, and maybe it's becoming less and less this, but traditionally we've sent them off to college and said there's no place for you. So you find yourself at a time where you finally get to make decisions for yourself. You're like autonomous in so many ways, and you're like trying to be an adult and a kid. Like college is the only time that you ever could say the sentence, I was studying to be a doctor this morning, and this afternoon I was on a slip and slide, and that would make sense,
Yes.
you know? And so it's
Yes.
like they are stuck in between those two tensions. And it's like, hey, there's like a real battle for your soul and affections in the middle of that. And who is helping guide them? Because they're desperate for it. I mean, it's that whole Paul said, you got a lot of teachers and no fathers. It's a fatherless generation. So you're like, hey, there needs to be people that are standing in the gap here. And if like our God is a loving father that isn't just letting his kids go by the wayside, then we should be demonstrating that in our churches. And I guarantee you the churches that have young adult ministries that are strong and healthy also find themselves having a much better percentage of people that they are retaining from youth all the way up until the point where they're actually making an income and they're building a family and that sort of thing.
It was interesting whenever God was calling me to it, I ended up randomly having all these conversations, like literally just on the playground when I was taking my kids to play with college girls that were telling me they didn't have anywhere to go. Like they're like, am I just supposed to serve in the children's ministry? Am I just supposed to, wait and then come back when I'm married? Am I supposed to go ahead and go to like women's or men's or whatever? Like it was, I kind of had in my head just kind of like a lost generation. Like they didn't know where they fit in.
That's so good. There's like a unique, right? There's a unique set of things that you need help with at that time too. Where it's like, how are the scriptures speaking to, I mean, you talk to a lot of people like single people, where do they go? There's not really a place for them that's celebrated in the church traditionally. But then more than that, it's like, there's not a high likelihood I'm going to put together any kind of what most people call series, but we call it a collection of conversations at our church. But like, there's no way I'm planning on any time getting up and talking about singleness and dating.
Yeah, you're right. That's not normally going to be a series probably on a Sunday morning. So what would you say, like people listening and they're like, yeah, we should do that. Like what is the next step, do you think? Because it's really hard to start a ministry or to know what to do because you don't want to, hurt anyone's feelings.
Sure. I think this will apply to most people that are listening. It doesn't really matter how big your church is. My thing is always gather two. Just find two of them and gather them together. Lay out your heart for them and lay out your heart for what you think there needs to be in your church as far as a community goes. You don't have to be on staff to do this. You probably want the blessing of like church leadership to do this, but I think there's something really powerful if you can say, hey, I want to gather two and I want to be able to meet at our church property, in our church building. To me, it echoes a couple of things. Like number one, like we value you, like we're thinking about you, that we want to create a place for you. Number two, we'll open up our place for you. So it's like, if we're not just going to open up our home, we'll open up our physical building. We'll open up our resources in order to pour into you in the same way that you can probably see that that's happening for legitimately every other demographic that you could possibly think of. And so if you can gather two, you'll find that the two will gather four. And I think like that's the thing. God's a God of multiplication. And people are craving community at a time probably unlike any other. And I think like one of the beautiful things coming out of a time like COVID is that people realize even if you're an introvert, it's like, hey, I might like a little bit of alone time, but I certainly don't like isolation. And so I definitely need a community of people that are walking with me in the middle of this. And if we're missing that demographic, shame on us. Like we have an opportunity right there to gather what I think is the current generation of the church. It's not even the next generation. It's just the word that makes the most sense right now. I
do want to ask before, just because we're talking about this age group, do you see many girls going into ministry right now?
Yeah, I think probably more than ever. And I'm thankful for that. I think one of the things that's been, difficult over the past several years is that conversation in the church. If there's been one pivotal conversation, it's about getting women involved in church leadership and ministry. And I think in a major way, I'll just go ahead and say this. I think the church has largely been built on the faithfulness of women dragging their families to church for decades,
Wow.
only to be told that they don't have a place in leadership and they don't have a voice, despite the fact that it's their voices that are bringing churches to a place where they're actually experiencing growth and they're actually experiencing like that faithfulness evolving and multiplying at a crazy pace. And so I know that I personally am the product of the faith of a couple of women in my life, probably more than anybody else. And so I might be a little bit biased, but I think women in church leadership is an absolutely critical thing that the church has missed the mark on a little bit over the past several years.
Yeah, and even if there are people that like agree it's important, I don't know if it's seen as like vital. I was talking to someone recently. I was like, no, it's not secondary. It's not secondary to tell someone that they don't have a call on their life. Like that's
Right.
it's very important. And I mean, I even would go so far, I believe it was actually a huge attack and a plan by the enemy, because if you look at our generation right now, who's having the most problems would be girls, not even really knowing what gender, right? I mean, we just have so much attack on being a girl. And then our age group, like I remember when I was called to ministry, I mean, it really was the generation that was not encouraged to go to seminary, really kept silent. And we could really use girls right now that know theology and that know how to witness and that know their stuff. And so I believe it was even more of an actual attack because it was almost a completely silenced and stopped generation. I think it's changing now, but man, could we have used all the girls that were probably discouraged from ministry and that, I think we're reaping the repercussions of, but of course can be turned around. Okay, I'm going to ask you this because we're about to be done. We know, what do you young adults care about? Dating, getting married. What is your best marriage advice for young adults?
Holy smokes, best marriage advice. I think the best marriage advice that I give to young adults is instead of being focused on what it is that you're looking for in another person, be focused on being that person yourself. I think it's very easy right now to find yourself, if you're a young adult, looking repeatedly at what is it that someone else is going to bring to the table for me. And what you'll find is that if you're bringing stuff to the table that is something that's valuable, somebody else will come up to the table that also wants to find themselves in a place sharing something similar. And so very often, it's probably the biggest comparison generation that there's ever been. And so it's really easy to start just kind of looking at people in a way that you can consume versus looking at them in a way where you can say, hey, I actually am looking to cultivate a relationship with the person. So my analogy all the time, especially because people say, hey, you got to test drive the car before you buy it. I love using the car analogies as far as dating and sex go with people, because I'm like, hey, here's the deal. Like, when did we start looking for a spouse the way that we shop for cars? I need this make and model. I need it to be this big of wheels. I want the windows to do this. And it's just like, hey, don't be looking for features. Look for fruit. Look for fruit and make sure you're bringing some to the table yourself.
We're wrapping up for today. Can you tell our audience where they can connect with you and learn more about your ministry?
Yeah, absolutely, Julia. So anybody that wants to find me, I've got a really obscure last name. So you can just look for me pretty much on any social platform. It's just Luke Lezon, Lukelezon, and you'll find me. And anybody that wants to grab my book, Your Mess Matters, you can just find that on Amazon by looking up my name, just like I spelled it right there. And I'd love to connect with anybody that wants to online or that's read the book. Would love to reach out. And just really thankful for the opportunity to connect with you, Julia, and to connect with them. So I'm hoping it's beneficial for them.
Oh, awesome. All right. Well, thank you for being on, and we're cheering you on in your ministry.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Unapologetic. Remember that you can hear today's episode and more at ptv.org/Julia and wherever you get your podcasts.
Stay connected with Julia and Unapologetic on all social media channels. Go to ptv.org/Julia.